Okay, I think all seating crises and technological crises have been dealt with. Please remember to silence your phone this evening. I'm usually the #1 culprit, so I also have to check. Just in terms of housekeeping, Hannah Chalew is going to give us a lecture that'll be followed by Q&A. And so let me begin now. My name is Ben Hickey. I'm the curator of exhibitions here at the Hilliard Art Museum, and it is my immense pleasure to welcome all of you in attendance, as well as Hannah Chalew, who's leading this lecture and who is the 2022 Southern Prize winner. Just a little bit, yes. Just in terms of South Arts, the 2022 Southern Prize and State Fellows exhibition downstairs is a showcase of the best of Southern visual art. It really is a powerhouse exhibition. It's organized by South Arts and features a wide variety of styles, media, and perspectives. The Hilliard is the final stop for this traveling exhibition. And the past venues include the Bo Bartlett Center at Columbus State University in Georgia, the Stephen F. Gately Gallery at Francis Marion University in South Carolina, and the 701 Center for Contemporary Art, also in South Carolina. Chalew earned her BA from Brandeis University and her MFA from the Cranbrook Academy of Art. Her exhibition record is extensive, so I won't go on too long, but her work's been shown at Laumeier Sculpture Park, the Asheville Museum of Art, Dieudonné, Newcomb Museum of Art, the Historic New Orleans Collection, the Contemporary Art Center, New Orleans, and the Ogden Museum of Southern Art. You've also read about her in all the places, in Burnaway Bomb Magazine, 64 Parishes, the Los Angeles Times, the Boston Globe, Pelican Bomb, rest in peace, Oxford American, and notably in the Unfathomable City, a New Orleans Atlas by Rebecca Snedeker and Rebecca Solnit, published by University of California Press. So that is going to be on my mandatory reading list very shortly. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Hannah Chalew.
Thank you, Ben. It's so nice to be here and have my work here. When I won the Southern Prize, I was by myself in Georgia, so it's really cool to be here with all of you in Louisiana, speaking to a Louisiana audience with my work here to celebrate it. I'm going to talk about my work, sort of the lens of this idea of collapsosophy that I've been thinking about recently, this idea that we're kind of at this moment facing all of these environmental, social, political crises with like a collapse that we can see coming, and how do we look ahead and not just try to survive, but thrive, and sort of what kind of work do we need to do within ourselves, with each other, and with all creatures to create, build a better future. Think of this as an opportunity. And I'm excited to ground this where my work is rooted here in Southern Louisiana with an audience that will really understand the references I'm making. Usually I'm showing this over Zoom or around the country, so there's a lot of maps, and this is like exciting because y'all don't really need these maps. But just to begin, the shape of Louisiana we're used to seeing on the road signs, the boot shape, versus the actual walkable land, which the pink triangle is New Orleans, but we can see that the toe of the boot is missing. And for the past, 6 years, my work has really been exploring how did we get to this place. I grew up here in Southern Louisiana and sort of all throughout high school learned these facts about how many football fields of land we were losing, but it was hard for that to really connect with me. So in the past few years, I've been digging into how did we get to this place and thinking about how can I as an artist make work that helps us think about a different way moving forward. So there's a lot of reasons we're losing our coastline, which I'm sure y'all are familiar. But one of the biggest drivers is the oil and gas industry, and this industry we know is sort of also exacerbating the issues we're facing. So this top map is put out by, oh, y'all can't really see my clicker, but top left is the map put out by the DNR of all the pipelines going across our coast, and the top right is all of the offshore oil wells, which is actually not mapped, but my friend is a cartographer and he is mapping those. And then the map below, you can kind of see how the overlay of all those pipelines and the canals that need to be dredged overlays with like the lost land. And as we know, the extracting and burning of fossil fuels makes sea levels rise and seas warmer, which creates more dangerous or more perfect situations for hurricanes to be stronger. And at the same time, our natural buffer has been decimated. So we're sort of on this bleeding edge in southern Louisiana where we're really entrenched in these industries that are causing this change, and we can also actively see this change happening. So in digging into that, I'm like, how did we get to this mentality where we're treating our environment in this manner, this beautiful place we live? And in 2018, I participated in Fossil Free Fest, which is a festival put on in New Orleans, and it was dedicated to thinking about what does it mean to take money for art and for education from these industries, from the oil and gas industries, and also kind of how can we change that paradigm and think beyond that funding. And that has been hugely impactful for the way I've been thinking the past few years. And also the Toxic Tour, which there's this image on the bottom left, was part of Fossil Free Fest. And that tour had a really big impact on me. Basically the Toxic Tour, oh, interesting. Okay. Just trying to make sure this is the right slideshow. It is. The Toxic Tour was basically taking us to Cancer Alley, which is this industrial corridor between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, along the Mississippi River that used to be lined by plantations in the time of enslavement. And you can see the yellow dots in this GIF are all the sites of former plantations. And then the red dots are now where chemical plants are sort of on the same lands. And this is, I think, really helpful for me in understanding how this sort of exploitation of our landscape and people, and sort of seeing people as disposable from the time of enslavement, and sort of how white supremacy and capitalism has been this through line to our current petrochemical age, where we're still sort of exploiting our landscape and seeing certain populations as disposable. And I mean, I live in New Orleans, and we think of ourselves as outside of Cancer Alley, but the air doesn't stay there, the water certainly does not stay there. We get our drinking water from the Mississippi. So this is sort of an issue that also faces all of us. So sort of digging into the petrochemical industry and then learning about this historical legacy. And also this is Maps from Petrochemical America, which is a book I reference a lot, which is an awesome resource. So the top map shows all the chemical products that are produced in Cancer Alley in this region, and the bottom map is all of the plastic products. So this region is not just like a sacrifice zone for southern Louisiana, but globally, like these plastic products are going all over the world. So Louisiana is kind of a microcosm for what's at stake globally. So this is sort of where my current body of work is jumping off from, learning about this history and thinking about how it's playing out today. And Fossil Free Fest also really inspired me to think about, in my studio practice, how could I be as fossil free as possible? And doing that in a lot of different ways, but thinking about my materials and how I'm sourcing my materials. So I started to make my own paper, which is the paper that's in one of the drawings downstairs, which I'll show you. I learned that they used to make paper from sugarcane in Louisiana in like the 1860s. And sugarcane was a chattel slavery crop and is still grown in Louisiana. The top left image is like a sugarcane field with like the Shell refinery in the background. And at sugarcane refineries, they produce mountains of bagasse, which is their waste product. So this is the bagasse in just like a hangar at this Lula sugar refinery in Belrose, Louisiana. And the worker is just like shoveling me 2 Tupperwares full that I'm using to make paper. So thinking about bagasse as another renewable resource, and also very specific to this landscape and this history. And then combining that with shredded plastic as sort of the current harbinger of how we're exploiting the landscape and people. And this is sort of a scan of what the paper looks like before I've drawn on it. This is a little bit of process. So I hope I can play this video. Okay, so I've fermented the sugarcane and basically breaking it down to get it ready for making paper. And then I'm collecting single-use disposable plastic sort of around my studio, and that's, to me, another renewable resource, plastic waste as a material. And then in the paper-making vat, I'm combining the sugarcane with the shredded plastic, and through water, sort of the magic of paper making, this alchemical combination happens and creates this new material that for me is sort of telling this historical legacy with what's happening today. And that's like, each pull is like 12 by 12 piece of paper. And then, how do I get to the next slide? This is sort of how I'm making giant pieces of paper, is pulling each piece of paper and tiling it into these big sheets. And I'm working here with my intern, Hillary Boehm, who was a Tulane senior who studied environmental science and art and was really awesome to work with. And she helped me do this process. That's sort of a little bit behind the scenes of how I'm making the paper. Okay, so then this is the drawing, one of the drawings that's downstairs, which I'm really excited to be sharing with y'all and talking with y'all about. And this drawing was kind of one of the first drawings I was doing using this plasticane paper, and also making my own ink, which I'm not gonna talk too much about the iron oak ink, but anyone in Kate Gordon's figure drawing class can tell you all about it, because they just learned how to make it today in class, which was really fun. But this drawing is about a specific community in Laplace, Louisiana, and they are fighting the denka plant, which produces chloroprene, but it emits 8 times the allowable level of a known carcinogen, and this community is fighting this plant. So on the top of the image is this oak tree that's growing on the edge of the facility, and on the bottom of the image is the plant itself, and then sort of the root system of the plants and the pipes are growing into each other, and sort of thinking about this inextricable place we're at, how it feels like where we're at in southern Louisiana as an oil and gas state, and then we're so, facing these issues, but wanting to kind of draw people in with that imagery. And then as you get closer to the drawing, the image sort of breaks apart, and then you get to see some of the materials and see how the plastic is showing up. And obviously we should all just go look at this in person later on, but you can see as you get closer, you see the little bits of plastic, and then maybe even recognize like a color of a brand, or like a styrofoam cup, and think about that coffee cup you used, or we're all implicated in using plastics. It's kind of unavoidable, even if we try. But thinking about, what changes can we make individually, and also what do we need to push for collectively. And then in the past few years, I've started to work more sculpturally with my drawing. So thinking about all of the pipelines crisscrossing our state, and wanting the structure of the drawing to sort of also embody that infrastructure. So I'm welding this sort of rebar structure where you can see the pipes underneath. And in this image on the bottom, you can see a little bit how it's sort of hangs flat on the wall, but comes out maybe like 2 feet. And then on the top left image, you can see, so the drawing is sort of coming apart as our coast is coming apart, as the wetlands are sort of coming apart. And I've also started to make this body of work I think of as sculptural drawings. So this piece is entitled Flottante, which is the French term for this floating marsh, which is a endemic kind of swamp that we have here in Louisiana that's not anchored to the bottom of the ocean or the bottom of the coast. It can rise and fall with the water level. So thinking about sort of how can we learn from our natural ecosystems that have adapted to a more watery landscape and the future we're facing, sort of what cues can we take from the landscape. And this piece itself, the drawing, is becoming more sculptural, and there's living plants in the work. So the piece is kind of becoming an ecosystem in itself. And you can see the paper is now sort of becoming paper mache and becoming the pipes itself. And then the sculptural form is also made from sugarcane. So I'm combining sugarcane and recycled paint and lime to create this kind of planter form, and that's what the plants are growing inside of. And then I'm pushing in bigger pieces of plastic. I'm shredding smaller plastic that's going into the paper, and then bigger pieces of plastic, like you can see this plastic bag and like the top of a bottle, are ending up sort of in the planter form, sort of thinking about the landscape we might leave behind or that might emerge out of our cultural detritus. And this is the sculpture that's downstairs right when you walk in. It's called Treblante, which is taken from La Prairie Treblante, which was another term for those kind of floating marshes. A trembling prairie was like the French term for these marshes that can rise and fall and sort of adapt to changing conditions. And thinking about our very precarious geography. So this piece is sort of, seems like it might almost tip over. I'm sure the preparators were nervous about that. It's pretty stable. And again, it's also becoming an ecosystem. So there's living plants planted inside of it. And this piece, you actually water it through the pipes. So thinking about all of this industrial infrastructure and like, could there be a second life once we turn from fossil fuel? Like, is there a possible way we could retool this infrastructure, or like a possibility for reframing this sort of nefarious infrastructure to be nurturing plants, and then also plants as thinking about, is this a landscape where we've made it no longer hospitable in southern Louisiana? People aren't here anymore. Or is this like how we're experiencing nature in the future? So with materials, trying to get materials that are either found or foraged or sustainable as possible, and also not taking fossil fuel money for my art practice, which I'm not going to talk about that much, but with the materials, it also has to makes me be as like very specific to the landscape. It's kind of like a unique challenge that makes the work be very specific to southern Louisiana, and also have to build connections with people and like connect with knowledge that we're no longer as connected to. So unfortunately, another renewable resource in southern Louisiana is pollution. So I worked with, over the years, I've been sort of volunteering in Cancer Alley and working with community-led organizations helping make art for protests and that kind of thing. And I met Miss Gail LaBeouf, who's on the left here, and I pitched this idea of the pollution, and she kind of helped me identify sites where I could find the pollution, and also just kind of gave me a personal tour of the area. So this is this coal export facility that's in Ascension Parish on the Mississippi River, and this is the ditch that's outside of the facility. Like on the top far left, you can see sort of the mountains of coal, and then this is outside of their fence line. The ditch is black with their sort of coal runoff. So I, with proper PPE, collected this mud, and then back in my studio, I sort of dried it out and ground it down and then sifted it into a pigment. And it's sort of this fossil fuel pollution ink, which basically carbon black ink was essentially from soot, was that. But wanting this material, thinking about the idea of reframing this pollution and like, what does that mean to use that as an art material? And then I also used the ink to make a banner for Inclusive Louisiana so that they could also, you know, use that ink. And it was really important to me. I was able to get a number of grants for this project and throughout, giving money also directly to Inclusive Louisiana. So feeling like using my platform as an artist to raise exposure to these issues, talking to y'all about this kind of stuff, but also directly contributing financially when I can. And then this is the first drawing where I was using that coal pollution ink and now using it with the iron oak gall ink, which we just made in Kate Gordon's class, which was really fun. But that ink sort of fades to a more sepia over time, and then the coal ink is this cooler black, so this sort of subtle shifts. And the past couple years, it looks like this will work. I've also been making, the past year, I've been figuring out how to make my own greens, which this is taken from my reel on Instagram. But yet making yellows from goldenrod, which is kind of like a weed, not quite yet in season, and maybe the drought ruined it, with indigo, another chattel slavery crop. And I know a black farmer who's very intentionally growing indigo, and that's where my indigo is coming from. And then copper scraps, which is something I can, you know, defining my ecology living in a city, that's something I can sort of find, combining the copper and the goldenrod and the goldenrod and the indigo to make this shade of greens. And these leaves are in a piece you're going to see in a couple slides, which is exciting. I'm also going to be sharing some new work. And then this is the first drawing where I'm integrating the greens into the drawing itself. The top of this drawing is an oak tree that had fallen during Hurricane Ida a couple years ago in New Orleans. And the bottom of the drawing is the Louisiana offshore oil port loop, which is offshore, but they have these big pipelines crisscrossing the wetlands, and it's this strategic oil hub. But just thinking about sort of these feedback loops in our landscape of stockpiling and extracting oil and gas, and then these sort of stronger hurricanes and this sort of endless feedback loop it feels like we're caught in. But in the same time, the structure of the drawing is built out. So at the top, there's like a metal armature, but then you can see the bottom is just sort of sagging and wanting the architecture at the bottom will loop this like industrial infrastructure to like become flaccid, and imagining a time in the future where, you know, our kids look back and think like, how could we have remained invested in this infrastructure for so long when we knew how dangerous it was, and, you know, looking towards a future where this is the past, if that makes sense. And this is my current palette as it stands, with the goldenrod with the actual plant itself, the oak galls, which we made that in class today, the coal pollution with the raw material. I also make ink from bricks and sheetrock, and that's what the copper looks like, indigo, and then also rust. And then it's planted with living plants. You can see the detail shot a little bit better, where you can see in the sort of planter form, that's a combination also of sugarcane. I'm using recycled paint and lime, and then you can see there's like Christmas lights and fruit netting, all this sort of plastic stuff that's ubiquitous in our lives that we use for such a short time and then is just going to be around forever. That is then becoming this planter for these living plants, and then sort of my plants are sort of hybridizing with this form, and the piece is called Bottomland Chimera, and chimera is the mythical term for this sort of monster made of incongruous parts, but it's also the term for when a plant mutates, like on its own, this sort of mutation in the plant. So like, are these plants gonna be hybridizing with this infrastructure when we're gone? Are they gonna become these kind of super monster plants? Or like, how will, if we don't change course, how will our ecosystems continue to evolve once we're gone? And I've been really into making my own cypress knees and sort of thinking about, when you see a tree that swallows a fence, sort of like the cypress knees and pipes hybridizing with also my plantar forms. There's living plants also growing in that. And then a little detail where you can see this sort of arrowhead vine that I'm making out of my paper and the ink, and it's paper mache over wire, so it's sort of defying gravity like the vine might. And then sort of our old Brita filter lid and Mardi Gras beads, and then like living plants growing out of that. So sort of the future life of all of this, all of our consumption, and thinking about what happens to all of this stuff and the decisions we're sort of making very casually all the time. And palmate cultivar is the last new piece I'm gonna share with y'all, which is, again, the palmetto leaf is my paper, and I'm painting it with the green pigments, and then it's sort of growing out of this metal pipe. Cultivar is the term for when you graft two plants together, sort of the end product. The new plant is called the cultivar. So like, is this sort of weird man-made scientific thing that's happening in the future? Is this palmetto adventitiously growing out of this abandoned pipe, or is this sort of the way we'll experience nature in the future? And that's a detailed view. So I kind of machine sewed all of the leaves to create the palmetto leaf, and then there's a metal armature that I hand sewed. So sort of this slower way that I'm choosing to work as an artist. We all have access to the internet and can get these materials at our fingertips through our phones, but thinking about how to sort of model a slower, more intentional way of interacting with my materials and my ecosystem as also a model. And I want to say that being, fossil-free, trying to be fossil-free in my practice, I'm not militant about this. I live in New Orleans, and we drove a car to get here, and I don't think that each of us recycling is going to solve the crisis we're in. And the idea of a carbon footprint was actually coined by BP to make us, British Petroleum, which we're all familiar with down here, but to make the individual feel like this is our responsibility, not this huge company spilling oil everywhere. But I do think that each of us has power, and we can make changes, and ultimately coming together and holding these industries accountable, or pushing the government to do that, or all of the above, is a possible path forward. And that's the end of my artwork. And speaking of sort of working collectively, I referenced some of the groups that I've worked with or that are doing really awesome work. And a lot of these groups are in New Orleans, but some are working more broadly in southern Louisiana. If anything felt inspiring, or you want to get involved in stuff. And these are the ways you can reach me and learn more about my work. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for a few questions, if there are any. Are there any questions? You're the first one.
How long have you been making art?
That's a good question. I guess forever. But I went to NOCA in New Orleans Center for the Creative Arts, which was an awesome opportunity. So that's when I really started to take my practice seriously in high school. But I was always drawing, and hopefully always will be.
Are you getting pushback from the industries?
No.
No.
I mean, I'm sure that I'm losing opportunities for the decisions I'm making, or in choosing to talk about this stuff. Or basically in New Orleans, the Hellas Foundation sponsors every art thing in New Orleans, and they are the Hellas Oil and Gas Company. And I talk about that a lot, so I'm definitely not getting their money, and I'm probably losing opportunities. But I feel like that will also connect me to people that could help support my work, or more in line with my work and what I want it to be about.
So when you're making the indigo was one of the most dangerous processes that slaves had to work with in the 1800s. So how has the technology changed to get dye from the plant?
Yeah, I mean, I get it from this farmer who is he's a black farmer in New Orleans, but his family's from St. Charles Parish, and he thinks of himself as descendants of enslaved people, and what does it mean for him to be cultivating that plant? But he's fermenting it himself in a small batches. But yeah, I mean, I think on that scale, it's definitely time consuming. You have to kind of feed. I don't know totally about the process, but it's a process of fermentation that you're constantly feeding. But I don't think the scale is probably not as dangerous. But yeah, interesting question.
I saw someone else raise their hand and I lost track of you.
So I guess I had a similar question to the fellow behind me, but I was wondering if you could go into your trajectory as an artist a little bit, and what the moment was when you decided to work with these different renewable media, if there was one.
Yeah. I always was interested in art and could always draw well, so I was kind of pushed into that. And then I ended up majoring in art in college, and then when I was in college was right when Prospect One was happening in New Orleans, this big art biennial attracting all of these artists to the city. So that made it seem like a good place to come back and make art. And I had been away. My freshman year of college was when Katrina hit New Orleans. So I had been away for 4 years, and then returning home, came back to this very changed landscape, and was making plein air drawings at the time. So sort of used drawing to explore place, and started to think about this sort of nature culture nexus, or places that had been abandoned or people couldn't return to after Katrina, how ecosystems were coming back and sort of taking over abandoned structures. And then I moved away for grad school, and really in deciding to move home in 2017 to a city below sea level in a time of rising seas, and knowing that I wanted to start a family, what does it mean to move to a city below sea level in our current age, and making works on paper in a city below sea level. So then really decided to make my artwork about exploring how did we get here, and how could my art sort of help inspire change, and then really getting involved with the Fossil Free Fest and people sort of critically thinking about how did we get to this place, and wanting to, this sort of creative construct of being fossil free has also been a good sort of box to work within as an artist, of this is the constraints, and how can I creatively respond to that, and that's been really fruitful. And I feel my palette just keeps kind of building as I'm like trying to like learn all these different ways of making materials, and through that also connecting with people or like indigenous people that still have this knowledge, or just people around the world that are practicing things that have become a little bit esoteric. We've become sort of disconnected from our landscapes and disconnected from this knowledge. And it's been really, for me, really meaningful, and also just kind of like inspires me to keep working, and is a fun way to also teach about my practice. Like oak gall ink, like I can show y'all what oak galls look like, and we could find them on the oak tree out there, and then we could all be making this art material that's sort of very specific to this place. So sort of a long answer, but yeah.
All right, I think we have time for one last question, if there is one.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but you use real plants in your pieces, right?
Mm-hmm. Living plants, yeah.
How do you keep those plants alive?
That's an interesting question. I mean, the piece downstairs, Tremblant, like that exhibition has been traveling since last September, and I like sent very specific instructions for how to keep them alive, but also like every institution didn't know there was a piece coming with living plants to know that they needed natural light. I mean, this was like, there's a lot of moving pieces, and a lot of museums won't even let you bring in living plants. But I mean, the piece has sort of like a way you water it and instructions to water it. And in my studio, I have like windows, and I'm just like able to water it, but that is, makes it trickier to show the work, and for the work to, I mean, this work came like 2 months before it went on display, right? Like.
Yes, we had to wheel it out at night in front of the windows for it to.
Yeah, thank y'all for taking that care. And yeah, there's a lot of moving pieces with it. Or like this image is like from my courtyard installation that's outside, and that obviously the plants are doing the best. But if there's natural light and water, yeah, it's like a sole of a shoe. Yeah, I've also, always looking for interesting trash. Is there time for one more? I don't know. These plants, I mean, now they're like in my studio courtyard. I kind of like take plants in and out of that, but like our yard or like our house plants. But the kind of stuff that does well, like you'll see the kind of stuff that's kind of houseplants, but kind of also does good in southern Louisiana outside. But yeah, I'm just sort of growing it myself now in different places.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank y'all.